Greetings, fellow readers and story lovers, and welcome back to my channel. We have reached the final scene of Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare, which is Act 5, Scene 3. We've got a lot of ground to cover in this video, so let's dive straight back in with the recap. Basically, what you need to keep in mind is that every act has a central idea or purpose, and every scene in that act links back to this central idea. So Act 1's purpose is to introduce the audience to the world of the play and all the characters in it. So in the first scene, we're introduced to the Capulet-Montague feud and the general idea of conflict. Shakespeare shows us, within the first few lines, that the feud is so ingrained in the characters' minds that it transcends class by having even the family's servants squabble about it. We're also introduced to Tybalt and Benvolio as a pair of foil characters. Tybalt embodies the kind of toxic, honor-bound masculinity that would have been very prevalent at the time, while Benvolio acts as the peacekeeper. He's also the only one of the younger generation who survives the play, so make of that what you will. And last but not least, we meet Romeo, a young man in love with the idea of love. He starts the play being completely heartbroken over this girl named Rosalind, whom the audience never gets to meet, and ends up falling head over heels in love with Juliet. But we'll get there. Scene 2 introduces us to Paris, who we learn wants to marry Juliet. This sets up the later conflict between Paris and Romeo as potential suitors for Juliet. This is also the scene where Romeo learns about the Capulet ball taking place later that night and decides to sneak in with his friends. In scene 3, we meet Juliet, her mother, and the nurse. We learn that Juliet is still pretty young, only 13, and fairly obedient when it comes to her parents. She has no innate interest in getting married, yet she agrees to check Paris out at her parents' party. We also learn that she and the nurse are pretty close. The nurse calls her by affectionate pet names and says that Juliet was the prettiest babe that e'er she nursed. Scene 4 sees Romeo on his way to the Capulet ball with Benvolio and Mercutio. This scene mainly introduces us to Mercutio, who is a sort of anti-Romeo. Where Romeo is dreamy, idealistic, and romantic, Mercutio is witty, cynical, and pragmatic. But it also provides us with some foreshadowing when Romeo says that some consequence yet hanging in the stars shall bitterly begin his fearful date, meaning he has a bad feeling about going to the Capulet ball. Scene 5 is where the Capulet ball takes place. This is the inciting incident of the play, where our two main characters, Romeo and Juliet, meet and fall in love. I have analyzed this scene in detail, so I'm not going to spend much time on it here and move on to Act 2. Act 2's central idea is that Romeo and Juliet are in love, but their love needs to be kept private and secret due to their family's animosity toward each other. In the first scene, Romeo sneaks unseen by anyone into the Capulet orchard to catch a glimpse of Juliet. Act 2, Scene 2 is the famous balcony scene where Romeo and Juliet talk in private and agree to get married the very next day. In the third scene, Romeo arranges his marriage to Juliet with Friar Lawrence in private. In scene 4, he meets with Juliet's nurse and discusses his plans with her, but only after his friends have already left. In scene 5, the nurse relays all of that information to Juliet, and Juliet alone. Her parents are none the wiser. And in scene 6, Romeo and Juliet get married in Friar Lawrence's cell in secret. And this brings us to Act 3. Act 3 is where Romeo and Juliet's private love meets public consequences. And that much becomes evident from its very first scene. This scene is where the first deaths of the play happen. Tybalt seeks out Benvolio and Mercutio, looking for Romeo, with whom he still has a bone to pick for showing up at the Capulet ball uninvited. He already wanted to kill him then and there. Mercutio relentlessly teases Tybalt until Romeo shows up, at which point Tybalt single-mindedly wants to fight Romeo, which Romeo refuses because he's married to Juliet, which makes Tybalt his cousin by marriage. Mercutio misinterprets Romeo's refusal as cowardice and fights Tybalt himself, which promptly gets him stabbed. Romeo then abandons all his earlier restraint, fights Tybalt, and ends up killing him. He flees the scene of the crime, so when the prince shows up, Benvolio explains the situation, emphasizing the fact that Romeo did not want to fight Tybalt initially. The prince then banishes Romeo from Verona. Scene 2 has Juliet waiting for Romeo to arrive so that they can spend the night together. Her anticipation and excitement get dampened, though, when the nurse shows up to tell her that Tybalt has been killed and Romeo has been banished. Juliet makes it very clear which of these two she finds worse, it's Romeo's banishment, and threatens to kill herself over it, so the nurse goes to fetch Romeo. Scene 3, meanwhile, has Romeo hiding in Friar Lawrence's cell. The friar informs him of the prince's decision to merely banish him from Verona, which Romeo, in typical Romeo fashion, overreacts to, saying it's a fate worse than death because it separates him from his beloved Juliet. Keep in mind that she has been his beloved Juliet for about 24 hours at this point. The nurse arrives and informs Romeo that Juliet is upset, which immediately makes Romeo want to kill himself. The friar calms him down, comes up with a pretty reasonable plan, and sends Romeo to spend the night with Juliet so that they will both not kill themselves. Meanwhile, Juliet's parents plan Juliet's marriage to Count Paris in scene 4. Scene 5 is where everything comes to a head for Juliet. Romeo is forced to leave due to his banishment. Her mother informs her that her father has already arranged her marriage to Count Paris for this Thursday, which is just 2 days from where we are in the play right now. And when she refuses, her father completely loses his temper and threatens to kick her to the streets. As a last resort, she turns to the nurse for help, asking her how the marriage to Paris can be prevented. However, the nurse advises her to go ahead with it, seeing as Romeo may as well be as good as dead to her given his banishment. Now, the nurse is coming from a place of reason and practicality here, but unfortunately completely ignores Juliet's emotional reality. Abandoned by everyone she thought she could trust, Juliet decides to go to Friar Lawrence for help, but already determines that if he can't come up with a solution to her predicament, she can always kill herself. So the tragedy has gone from moving around Juliet to closing in on her personally. Let's see what Act 4 has in store for her now, shall we? The first scene of Act 4 has Juliet going to Friar Lawrence's cell, where Count Paris is currently making arrangements for their wedding. He tries to flirt with Juliet, but she does not reciprocate. While she remains outwardly polite, her answers are really evasive because she cannot let Paris know the real reason she objects to their marriage. When Paris leaves, her tone shifts dramatically. She tells the friar that she would rather kill herself than marry anyone but Romeo. The friar, recognizing her desperation, gives her a vial of potion to drink when she is alone that will put her into a death like sleep. Her parents will immediately bury her, as that's the custom in Verona, and Friar Lawrence will inform Romeo of the plan via letter so that he will be at the Capulet tomb when Juliet awakes. Then they can both go to Mantua and live there happily ever after. Juliet very eagerly agrees to the plan. This scene does two things. First, it escalates the friar's role in the tragedy. Up until this point, he's only really been involved in their secret wedding, as he was the one who married them, and tried to act as a voice of reason to primarily Romeo. Now he's the one that comes up with a risky plan that involves faking someone's death. That's quite a big step up, if you ask me. And second, it gives Juliet a lot more agency. This is the first time in the play where Juliet has been allowed to act completely on her own. No parents, no nurse, no Romeo. She seeks out the friar. She threatens to kill herself if she's being forced to marry Paris, and she agrees to the friar's plan out of her own volition and conviction. That's quite impressive for a woman in Shakespeare's time period, don't you think? In scene 2, Capulet is making arrangements for Juliet's wedding to Count Paris. When Juliet returns from Friar Lawrence's cell, she pretends to be quite excited for the wedding, which pleases Lord Capulet to no end. So much so that he moves the wedding another day forward to Wednesday, so the next day, instead of Thursday. This is another moment of dramatic irony. From Lord Capulet's perspective, the wedding resolves everything, so moving it a day forward is a good thing. But the audience knows that Juliet is planning to fake her own death the night before her wedding, so they know that moving the wedding a day forward only escalates things further. At the beginning of scene 3, Juliet asks her mother and the nurse to leave her alone for the night, and then has her biggest soliloquy in the entire play. Bear in mind that in Shakespeare's time, women characters were played by young boys, so Shakespeare apparently put a lot of trust in these young actors. In this soliloquy, she lets the audience in on the various emotions that she's feeling. First, she lets us know that she is afraid to take the potion. She considers calling the nurse back in, but ultimately decides that she must act alone. This showcases her fear of death. She also worries whether the potion might not work at all or work entirely too well, i.e., really kill her instead of putting her in a death like sleep. She's afraid the friar might betray her, which, given how many times she's been let down by the people she was supposed to be able to trust, that's not entirely surprising, is it? Then she lets us in on her fear of the unknown when she wonders what will happen if she wakes up in the tomb too early. She worries that she might suffocate to death. And she wonders whether Romeo might be haunted by Tybalt's ghost, which showcases the lingering violence from Act 3, Scene 1 that hasn't been entirely resolved yet. In the end, however, she decides to take the potion, which is another act of agency that the play grants her. Act 4, Scene 4 mirrors the beginning of Act 1, Scene 5, in that the Capulet family is preparing for a grand celebration. In Act 1, Scene 5, it was the Capulet Ball. In Act 4, Scene 4, it's Juliet's wedding to Count Paris. However, those two scenes have vastly different outcomes. In Act 1, Scene 5, it led to Romeo and Juliet meeting and falling in love. In Act 4, Scene 4, it'll lead to tragedy because her family is about to find Juliet's body and think she's dead. And remember, the audience already knows this at this point. Paris arrives with musicians, and the nurse is sent to wake Juliet. Before the nurse enters Juliet's room, she makes some crude jokes about Juliet not getting any sleep on her wedding night, but obviously the mood shifts dramatically when she finds Juliet's body and informs her parents of Juliet's death. Everyone despairs at the sight of her, which I find a little ironic given how cruel both her mother and father have been just the morning before. The same father who told her to die in the streets for all she cares now acts quite devastated at the loss of his child. Count Paris also seems quite put out, though he seems to mourn more the loss of his wife more than the loss of Juliet as a person. I will come back to this when I talk about the opening of Act 5, Scene 3, so put it on the back burner for now. Friar Lawrence once again steps in as the voice of reason and tells everyone to calm down and that he will arrange Juliet's funeral. At the end of the scene, everyone but the musicians and Paris's servingmen leave, and they start an argument about payment, of all things. Now, this might seem a little out of place, it certainly did for me, but there are several possible reasons as to why this moment was included. The first could be as simple as the tradition of comic relief after intense moments. The characters have just found Juliet dead. It gives the audience a moment of reprieve after the play has steadily increased its tension over the last 4 acts. The second possible reason is that it deliberately undercuts the emotional intensity of the moment and reminds the audience that they are watching a play. Almost like a, hey, don't get too invested in this, it's just a performance. Kind of like you sometimes have to remind people that they're watching a show and that the characters on screen aren't real. And thirdly, this moment could potentially be a relic from the original stage direction, which read Enter Will Kemp. Now, Will Kemp was a famous comedic performer in Shakespeare's days, so this whole exchange might have been written in to give Kemp a chance to entertain the audience and was then simply never written out again. Anyway, this brings us to the end of Act 4, and we're now entering the final act, which consists of 3 scenes in total. Let's summarize the first two really quick before we dive into the final scene, shall we? The first scene has Romeo in Mantua waiting for news from Juliet. At the beginning of the scene, he wakes up from a dream where he was dead, but Juliet's kiss brought him back to life. File that piece of information away for later because we're going to come back to it. Then Balthazar arrives and tells him of Juliet's death. We also learn that he doesn't have a letter with him, so clearly something went awry with Friar Lawrence's plan here. As soon as Balthazar leaves, Romeo goes to an apothecary and buys poison to kill himself. Technically, selling these kinds of deadly poisons is illegal, but Romeo uses the apothecary's evident poverty to bribe him into selling this poison. This shows how desperate and almost morally dubious Romeo has become. It also showcases his very impulsive nature once again. Bad news arrives, and Romeo immediately springs into action without giving the situation even a moment's thought. His dialogue with the apothecary also shows that there are no small roles in Shakespeare plays. Even though the apothecary is only in this one scene, his singular conversation with Romeo already reveals a lot about him. I will link a short by Dame Sarah in the description if you want to know more about this. In scene 2, Friar Lawrence finds out that the letter to Romeo was never delivered. The other Franciscan friar, Friar John, returns and still has the letter with him. He explains that he was kept in quarantine in another town due to the plague and could not get to Mantua. Now, this might make it seem like the tragedy is caused by fate and circumstance, and it's certainly a good example of it. But hold your horses for a little while, my fellow readers and story lovers, because the answer is not as simple as that. And I will go into it in my final video for this scene, so I need you to keep that in the back of your minds till then. This is also the moment in the play where everything collapses in on itself. Before, Friar Lawrence's plan seemed risky but doable. Now it's downright impossible for it to work. And we're going to get into all the nitty gritty details of that once I've summarized the final scene. Act 5, Scene 3 opens with Paris on his way to Juliet's tomb. He wants to pay his respects to her. He sends his page to stand watch and strews flowers onto her grave. Then Romeo and Balthazar arrive. Romeo sends Balthazar away with a letter to Romeo's father that Balthazar is supposed to deliver in the morning and threatens him with death and dismemberment if he comes back and disturbs Romeo. Romeo then physically breaks into the Capulet tomb. Paris witnesses this and supposes that Romeo is up to no good. We're going to go more into why he thinks that in the next video, but for now let it suffice to say that Paris has no reason to assume that Romeo has any good intentions here. He tries to stop Romeo and they get into a fight. Romeo repeatedly asks Paris to leave, but again, Paris doesn't trust Romeo's intentions, so he doesn't go. Romeo kills him. Only afterwards does Romeo even recognize who he was fighting with, but promises to honor Paris's last wish to be buried with Juliet and carries him into the Capulet tomb. Paris's page, whom Paris has sent to stand watch earlier, if you remember, hears the altercation between them and goes off to alert the watch. Inside the Capulet tomb, Romeo beholds his beloved Juliet one last time and laments how beautiful she is, even in death. The irony is, of course, that she is not dead yet. After a long and frankly theatric soliloquy, the details of which we will get into in the next video too, he drinks the poison he bought from the apothecary in Mantua and dies instantly. The friar arrives, moments too late of course, climbs into the tomb and finds the bodies of Romeo and Paris. Then Juliet awakes from her death-like sleep and immediately asks for Romeo, which is quite sad when you think about it. The friar informs her that Romeo and Paris are dead and offers to bring her to a nunnery, which Juliet declines. We'll go into the reasons as to why she does that in the video after the next one. The friar, startled by a noise outside the tomb, leaves without Juliet. With Romeo dead, Juliet sees no other way but to kill herself too. She first tries to do it by kissing Romeo, hoping for some remnants of the poison to finish her off, which is the exact inverse of the dream Romeo had in Act 5, Scene 1. See, I told you to keep that little detail in mind. Juliet's plan doesn't work, however, so she stabs herself with Romeo's dagger and dies. The watchmen that Paris's page has alerted finally arrive and try to piece together the situation. They apprehend the friar and Balthazar in the churchyard and send for the prince, the Capulets, and the Montagues to come to the tomb. Everybody arrives in a very chaotic fashion and nobody knows what's going on. We also learn that Romeo's mother, Lady Montague, has died from grief over her son's banishment. The friar eventually explains the whole sorry tale and basically summarizes the entire play in the process. We will go more into the reasons for that in the last video I'm going to do on this scene. The prince admonishes both the Capulets and the Montagues for their feud and all the lives it has cost, and Lord Capulet and Lord Montague bury the proverbial hatchet by promising to build commemorative statues of both Romeo and Juliet. The end. All right, let's get into all those nitty-gritty details that I promised. At the start of the scene, Paris and Romeo are both grieving Juliet, but they're doing so in very different ways. Let's get into that, shall we? We're going to start with Paris because he's also the first to approach the tomb in this scene. After he sends his page away to stand watch, he says this: "Sweet flower, with flowers thy bridal bed I strew. O woe, thy canopy is dust and stones, which with sweet water nightly I will dew, or wanting that with tears distilled by moans. The obsequies that I for thee will keep nightly shall be to strew thy grave and weep." First of all, his speech is very calm and dignified. He speaks in rhymes, which makes his speech sound very orderly and controlled, but also elevated and maybe slightly rehearsed. I talked about this before. For example, when Romeo first lays eyes on Juliet in Act 1, Scene 5, he also starts talking in rhymes, which showcases the emotional intensity of the moment. Here, it's to show how solemn and dignified Paris is. As we will later see, this is to set him apart from Romeo. But let's talk about what he's actually saying here. He calls Juliet sweet flower. He's brought flowers for her grave, and he says that he will mourn and cry for her, and that he will come back every night to repeat this ritual. All this seems to indicate to me that he has had genuine feelings for Juliet and is genuinely grieving her loss. I said before, in the summary of Act 4, Scene 5, that Paris seemed more upset at the loss of his future wife than Juliet herself, but his behavior in this scene at least opens up the possibility that he feels genuinely sorry for her death. He presents the very picture of social acceptability. He's calm, he's dignified, he follows social convention, and mourns Juliet in a controlled and ceremonial manner. In short, he portrays the very husband that Juliet's parents wanted for her. And that's where he differs from Romeo. When Romeo arrives with Balthazar, his presentation is much more urgent and erratic. Here's what he says: "Give me that mattock and wrenching iron. Hold, take this letter. Early in the morning, see thou deliver it to my lord and father. Give me the light. Upon thy life, I charge thee, whate'er thou hearest or seest, stand all aloof, and do not interrupt me in my course. Why I descend into this bed of death is partly to behold my lady's face, but chiefly to take thence from her dead finger a precious ring, a ring that I must use in dear employment. Therefore hence be gone. But if thou, jealous, dost return to pry in what I farther shall intend to do, by heaven I will tear thee joint by joint, and strew this hungry churchyard with thy limbs. The time and my intents are savage wild, more fierce and more inexorable far than empty tigers or the roaring sea." So immediately there's a lot more urgency to Romeo's speech. He gives Balthazar a lot of commands like "give me, take this, and I charge thee," which I feel is meant to convey how he wants to feel in command and control, but is actually struggling to keep a hold of his sanity. He also lies to Balthazar when he says that he wants to retrieve a ring from Juliet's finger. Whether that is what he intends to do or not, it's certainly not Romeo's main purpose. He goes into the Capulet tomb to kill himself. But he doesn't want Balthazar to know that because he doesn't want Balthazar to interrupt or even stop him. This could almost be seen as a compassionate lie. As I talked about in my last video, suicide was considered a mortal sin, meaning that Elizabethans believed if you committed suicide, you would go to hell. So Romeo could be lying to Balthazar here because he doesn't want him complicit in his sin. However, all that goodwill goes out the window when Romeo threatens Balthazar with physical violence. He says that he will tear him joint by joint and strew this hungry churchyard with his limbs if Balthazar dares to come back and disturb Romeo in his endeavor. Now, this is quite the violent threat, which shows how desperate and erratic Romeo has become. Balthazar even responds to this by saying, "His looks I fear, and his intents I doubt," meaning that Romeo's mental state has in some way carried over into his physical appearance. This could either mean that he looks rather disheveled or wild and unkempt. So, all in all, this is quite the different presentation between Paris and Romeo. Paris is calm, dignified, and socially acceptable. Everything about him is orderly, while Romeo is wild and erratic and threatens his servant with physical violence. There's also a very visual difference between them. Paris strews flowers onto Juliet's grave, which is a very sweet and gentle act, while Romeo forcefully breaks open Juliet's tomb, which is a very violent act. The play certainly presents Romeo's grief as more dangerous and destructive than Paris's calm and dignified and socially appropriate behavior, but it doesn't qualify either of those expressions of grief. It doesn't tell us that Paris's version is less sincere, nor that Romeo's extremity makes his feelings more genuine. That's left for the audience to decide. But there is one crucial thing that Paris, Romeo, and Balthazar all have in common. None of them possess the full truth. Paris knows that Romeo killed Tybalt and believes Juliet is dead, but he knows nothing about their secret marriage or Romeo's suicidal intent. Romeo obviously knows about their secret marriage, but also believes that Juliet is dead because he never received the letter that Friar Lawrence has sent to him. Balthazar knows that Romeo is acting strange and is worried enough to remain nearby, but he doesn't understand Romeo's intentions well enough to stop him. Only the audience is in full possession of all the facts and understands the situation entirely, but we can't do anything about it either. There's also a bit of structural circularity here. Act 1, Scene 1 opened with a feud intruding into people's ordinary private lives. And now Act 5, Scene 3 opens with private grief spilling into public violence. But that's going to be the subject for my next video. For now, let's move into this video's conclusion. Act 4 has Juliet gain more and more agency. She seeks out Friar Lawrence to ask for a solution to her predicament, reinforces her choice of husband by threatening to kill herself if she's forced to marry anyone but Romeo, and agrees to the friar's potion plan out of her own free will and choice. As she gains more agency, it seems almost possible that the play's tragic outcome might be averted. However, Act 5 is where all hope comes crashing down. Romeo receives news of Juliet's death, but not of Friar Lawrence's plan, and immediately goes to buy poison in order to kill himself, which means that his impulsivity and immediate response become the reason for his downfall. That Friar Lawrence's letter never reaches Romeo is one of the strongest indicators of fate being at play, because it's not due to people being mean or ill intentioned, it's simply a case of bad luck and unfortunate circumstance. However, that does not definitively answer the question if Romeo and Juliet are doomed by fate, and I will go into it in more detail in one of the later videos. The beginning of Act 5, Scene 3 presents Romeo and Paris as two people grieving Juliet's death in very different ways. Paris is the perfect picture of social propriety and acceptability. He brings flowers for Juliet's grave, follows social conventions, and mourns her very calmly and ceremonially. Romeo, on the other hand, is presented as very wild, erratic, and dangerous. He threatens his servant with bodily violence and forcefully opens the Capulet tomb. However, each character is acting on incomplete information. Everybody thinks that Juliet is dead when she isn't. Paris doesn't know that Romeo and Juliet are married, so he has no way of knowing Romeo's intentions, and Balthazar doesn't know that Romeo is planning to kill himself. which means that everything is poised for the final confrontation between Romeo and Paris and for the tragedy to come to its dramatic close. But we're going to look at that in more detail in the next few videos. For now, this is me signing off. Because he never is. I really do like the word "rye." And dies instantly. We also learn that Romeo's mother, Lady no, he's not a Capulet. He is not a Capulet. I wonder if there were like Elizabethan arguments after they watched the play. Like if they left the Globe Theatre and were like, Juliet really should have chosen Paris. And then someone else would go like, no, she couldn't. She was already married to Romeo. She would have gone to hell. Yeah, well, she shouldn't have married Romeo behind her parents' back. I mean, I'm sure there were. But I don't know if we have like any records of those. We would have to find the diary of a very ordinary person who wrote about went to see Shakespeare's latest play today and you won't believe what Tiffany has said or something. Thanks everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like, share, and comment down below. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you don't want to miss any of my future videos. I also have a Patreon that you can subscribe to, starting at as little as $2 a month, which gives you early access to any of my videos. Higher tiers include access to exclusive Patreon-only content and the chance to suggest books, plays, or poems for any future analysis. For now, that is it from me, and I'll see you next time.